They said Thanksgiving was a celebration of gratitude, of family, of harvests and grace, but behind the soft glow of candles and the polite clinking of silverware, something older and colder was always hiding. The table was never just a table. It was a stage, a ritual, a reenactment of submission disguised as tradition. For centuries, the feast has served as both mask and mirror, concealing the hunger of those who feed on obedience. In the modern age, they call it family. In older times, it was called bloodline, a quiet empire that ruled through guilt, obligation, and the illusion of belonging. Every invitation to dine was an unspoken contract, every uninviting, a declaration of hierarchy. The estate where I now live, 6.2 million in appraised value but truly priceless in memory, was built not as a home but as a monument to reclamation. When they cut me out of the circle, I saw for the first time the architecture of control, the way they bound us to their rituals, the why generations were chained by phrases like tradition and respect. The turkey, the prayer, the forced smiles, all offerings to the invisible throne of conformity. But on that cold November evening, I turned their feast inside out. I invited 32 souls, strangers, wanderers, the forgotten, and fed them in defiance. We didn't eat to remember the past, we ate to dissolve it. I watched as the light in their eyes replaced the cold politeness I once mistook for love. The estate breathed for the first time, its halls echoing not with family names but with human laughter, unbranded and unowned. Somewhere, far away, my family toasted their victory, believing they'd cut me from the root. They never realized I had become the soil. What they called rebellion was simply remembering. Thanksgiving, as they designed it, was meant to remind us who we owed. Mine was built to remind us what we were owed: truth, choice, and the power to break the ancient banquet that has fed on our silence. Or generations. Long before the modern family gathered around polished tables and store-bought gratitude, there were councils cloaked in linen and secrecy who discovered that control was easiest when disguised as custom. They learned that the most effective chains are not forged of iron, but of expectation, that if you teach a child that love must be earned, the child will serve you for life. Those councils became dynasties, those dynasties became families, and those families became the architects of the social feasts we call holidays. Thanksgiving, Christmas, weddings, reunions, each one a theater of loyalty where attendance was worship and absence was rebellion. My bloodline, I later learned, had been among the keepers of that tradition, masking hierarchy as hospitality. The rituals evolved, but the intention remained unchanged. Gather the obedient, shame the divergent, and call it togetherness. In the archives beneath the estate, the part no one visits, built of old stone that remembers more than any living soul, I found the records, ledgers, invitations, even minutes of ancient meetings where attendance lists determined inheritance. And silence meant exile. It wasn't personal, it was procedural. Generations had practiced it, until cruelty felt sacred and obedience felt like love. When my family uninvited me, they were not breaking a bond, they were fulfilling a formula centuries old. I was the necessary offering, the one cast out so the illusion of harmony could remain intact. Yet the irony was divine. By removing me, they freed me. The blood oath they mistook for family was only a cage, and my exclusion was the first open door. So, as I fed those 32 guests, none of whom shared my name, all of whom shared my hunger, I understood that every empire needs its heretic. And perhaps that is what I was born to be. The table they denied me was not a punishment, it was an invitation to build a new one, ungoverned by lineage or law. The ancient architects had written their story in marble and ritual. I began writing mine in the warm breath of strangers. Their laughter was not rebellion, it was resurrection. When I began to look beyond the walls of the estate, I realized the family's reach was never limited to blood or inheritance. It had merely changed uniforms. The same logic that ruled the table ruled the city. A quiet hierarchy stitched into every institution that promised order. Governments recited the family's hymns in new dialects: policy, economy, loyalty, growth. They discovered that an empire built on affection was stronger than one built on fear, so they replaced whips with wages and chains with calendars. The ritual of Thanksgiving had been only the rehearsal, the true performance unfolded daily as people learned to bow not to patriarchs but to professions, not to elders but to efficiency. I walked through marble buildings where decisions were made in the same cadence as prayers. and I saw the old sigils carved discreetly. NTO architecture. Circles within circles. Triangles balanced on their points. Reminders that every system preserves itself first. Even rebellion, I learned, can be an inheritance if it serves the same structure. The family had merely evolved into abstraction, replacing surnames with symbols, estates with corporations, invitations with contracts. Their dinners became conferences, their toasts, press releases. Yet beneath the gloss, the hunger was identical, the hunger to be obeyed. I began to collect fragments of this hidden genealogy, laws echoing ancient decrees, financial instruments disguised as offerings, algorithms behaving like oracles. It all traced back to one principle: keep the feast going, no matter who's hungry. In the archives of the mind, I heard the same refrain: that unity requires exclusion, that progress requires sacrifice. But as I stood on the balcony of my estate, watching the lights of the city flicker like candles before an unseen altar, I wondered whether the time had come to end the feast altogether. Perhaps the real heresy was not rejection but revelation, the act of showing the guests that the table was never magic, that the host was never divine. If the family had built the world upon illusion, then truth itself would be the only rebellion left to serve. In the months that followed, the estate began to transform, not through design but through the quiet gravity of awakening. Word spread among the disenchanted, those who had tasted the feast of conformity and found it hollow, and they arrived without invitation, carrying nothing but their exhaustion. We did not call it a refuge, though it became one. We did not call it a rebellion, though it felt like one. There were no hierarchies here, no hosts or guests, only people learning again how to eat without performance, how to speak without reciting. The first nights were uneasy. Centuries of conditioning do not dissolve easily. Some still looked for someone to lead, to bless the meal, to name the purpose. But purpose, I told them, was the very illusion that built the family's empire. We ate in silence, not as ritual, but as remembering. I watched them shed the inherited politeness that had once kept their ancestors chained to gilded tables. The laughter that emerged was raw, imperfect, alive, the kind that could not be orchestrated or taxed. We began unearthing the symbols the family had left behind: crests carved into furniture, inscriptions behind portraits, even melodies that had once been sung to mark allegiance. We studied them not to worship but to understand. Each emblem told a story of power disguised as care, of love used as leverage, and in that understanding, something ancient began to fracture. The estate's walls, once pristine, became covered with drawings, ideas, plans for a world beyond obedience. Some nights we burned the old documents in the courtyard, not in anger but in gratitude. Gratitude for what their ashes might teach the soil. I knew the family would notice. Power never sleeps when its reflection changes. There were rumors of envoys in the city asking questions, of offers made to those who left our gates. But fear, once unmasked, loses its throne. We were no longer guests of their table. We had built our own ground. The estate that had once symbolized isolation now pulsed like a heartbeat, not of ownership, but of origin. And though the world outside still feasted on illusion, I felt the first tremor of its hunger turning inward. Something vast was beginning to wake. The change did not announce itself with trumpets or flames. It arrived like dawn through fog, almost invisible until everything was different. Those who had once served the feast began to pause mid-gesture, their hands uncertain over the platters of routine. Merchants closed their shops early without knowing why. Officials postponed decrees, and across the cities, silence began to bloom in the hours once filled with orders. The family signals, the banners, the slogans, the endless reminders to be grateful, still fluttered, but they no longer commanded belief. Something inside the people had shifted, an echo of the estate's laughter carried by rumor and dream. They said there was a place where no one was measured, where food was shared without blessing or debt, where names were forgotten and remembered at once. Some called it treason, others called it home. The councils sent emissaries to trace the disturbance, yet each envoy who came to observe stayed longer than intended, as if the air itself unthreaded ambition. Slowly, the machinery that once defined existence began to hesitate. Markets stumbled, monuments cracked, and within the fractures, weeds of imagination took root. The estate's fires, those small nightly flames of conversation, became beacons seen from miles away, though no tower stood. And I understood then that rebellion was never the opposite of order, it was its consequence. When the lie grows too large, truth does not. Shout, it whispers, and the walls remember. The people outside did not march or fight, they simply stopped believing, and belief had been the family's final weapon. As the great feast decayed into history, its aroma still haunted the air, sweet and poisonous. But beyond it, the first scent of rain returned, clean, uncertain, alive. The world was not yet free, but it had begun to remember how freedom smelled. The emissary came at dusk, when the horizon burned the color of rust and memory. He arrived without guards, dressed not in the family's sigils but in ordinary clothes, as if pretending to belong to the living. Yet the air around him carried the faint metallic scent of preservation, the odor of archives, of control. He asked no permission to enter. Doors yield easily to what once owned them. I had expected arrogance, perhaps a sermon about heritage, but he spoke softly, almost kindly, like a man reciting a eulogy for a house still standing. You've undone more than you know, he says. Aid. When the rituals die, the world loses its rhythm. His words were meant to sound like warning, but they trembled with something older than fear, relief. I saw then that he was not a master but a prisoner of the same tradition, bound by the duty to maintain the feast long after the appetite was gone. I poured him water, not wine, and we sat at the long table stripped of ceremony. The silence between us was vast enough to hold generations. We thought obedience kept us alive, he confessed, but it only kept us repeating. He slid a sealed letter across the table. Inside was nothing but a blank page, its whiteness heavier than confession. This, he said, is the family's final decree, silence. I realized that even their surrender had to be codified, recorded, signed. I refused to sign anything. Instead, I tore the page into small pieces and let them fall into the candle flame. The fire did not roar, it sighed, as though tired of its own purpose. The emissary watched until the ashes curled and vanished. Then he rose, nodded once, and left through the same door that had opened itself for him. Outside, the night had no edges. In the courtyard, those who had gathered felt the shift without words. The old order had not been destroyed. It had been released, dissolved into something unownable. For the first time in centuries, the world was not performing, it was breathing. The estate's gates stood open, not in invitation but in trust. And as the stars emerged, indifferent and infinite, I knew that the true rebellion was never against the family, it was against forgetting that life had always been free. Years passed, though time no longer carried its old weight. Seasons flowed through the estate like music remembered from childhood, recognizable yet changed. The grand halls where obedience once echoed became gardens of sound, laughter, footsteps, the low hum of people learning to live without measure. Children grew among the orchards that had been planted where the family wise portraits once hung, their roots feeding on the ashes of burned decrees. Travelers still arrived, though fewer now. Most came not to stay, but to listen, to stand in the stillness and feel that the air itself no longer asked anything of them. The city beyond the hills rebuilt itself slowly, stripped of banners and monuments. Commerce softened into exchange, law into understanding, and the word belonging lost its possessive edge. Some said the estate had become myth, a place that existed only when spoken of, a rumor of freedom told by those who had touched it once in a dream. I never corrected them. The truth was simpler. The estate was everywhere people remembered to eat without fear. The last of the ledgers decayed in the cellar, their ink fading into unreadable ghosts. One evening, an old friend asked whether I missed the structure, the certainty, the family. I told them structure had not vanished, it had changed hands. Each act of kindness, each moment of honest hunger built anew. Architecture, invisible but enduring. The estate was no longer mine, it never had been. It belonged to whoever refused to worship power disguised as love. And as twilight deepened, I realized that what we had built was not an ending but a pause, a breath between empires, a reminder that every table can be rebuilt if one person dares to clear it. The stars shone with their ancient indifference, and in that indifference I found peace. For the first time, the feast was truly over, and the world was quietly, unmistakably, alive. Time, once fractured by ritual, began to move again, though differently. Less like a command, more like a tide. The estate had softened into legend, but sometimes I walked its grounds at dusk to hear what stories the wind still carried. The orchards had grown wild, branches twisting together until it was impossible to tell which tree had come first. and I took comfort in that confusion. The world beyond our hills had changed in ways no decree could track, cities built plazas where monuments had fallen, trade became craft again, and the language of possession faded from daily speech. Yet freedom, I learned, is never permanent. It is a muscle that must be remembered each day, or it stiffens into ceremony. Visitors still arrived, not pilgrims now but curious wanderers searching for proof that the old order had truly ended. I told them there was no proof, only practice. The feast had not died, it had transformed into the simple act of sharing breath, of meeting without motive. Sometimes at night I dreamed of the emissary, his face lit by the same candle that had burned the family's final page. In the dream he smiled, not in triumph or regret, but as one who has finally rested. I understood then that even the architects of control were victims of their own perfection. The dawn that follows every empire is never loud, it rises quietly through the cracks left by exhaustion. Standing beneath that pale sky, I realized the purpose of the estate was never to oppose the family, but to outgrow it, to show that life continues after power, just as soil continues after fire. The children who now run through the fields will never know the taste of obligation masquerading as love, and perhaps that is enough. The world does not need new rituals, only new honesty. And so the story ends not with closure but with continuation. The endless work of remembering that every table, every conversation, every shared piece of bread is a chance to keep the feast from returning. I was born after the feast ended, though the elders still speak of it as if it were a season, not a story. They say the sky itself changed color that year, that the air tasted of metal and rain, that silence had weight. I do not remember any of that. What I remember is laughter echoing in rooms with no portraits and fields where trees grow without boundaries. To me, the estate has never been a fortress of rebellion. It is simply home, a place where questions are allowed to outnumber aeons. We are taught the history not as warning but as wonder, how people once built cages out of affection, how rituals became rulers, how one person's refusal opened 1,000 doors. I often wander the orchard where the oldest roots still clutch fragments of marble from the vanished hall. Touching those stones feels like holding both grief and gratitude at once. We do not call what we have peace, because peace suggests an ending. We call it motion, the steady rhythm of people learning to live without the hunger for command. Some nights travelers camp near the outer wall and tell tales of distant cities still tangled in echoes of the old ways, places where people bow to clocks, where gratitude is sold in glass bottles, where names still weigh more than truth. I listen and I feel no anger, only curiosity. Perhaps every age needs its own awakening. The elders never forbid remembrance, they simply remind us that memory is a seed, not a shrine. When dawn comes, I walk to the hilltop and watch the light touch the roofs, and I imagine the ancestors, those who once enforced the feast and those who broke it, standing side by side, surprised to find themselves forgiven. The world they built and unbuilt now breathes through us, imperfect and alive. I do not know if the feast will ever return, but if it does, we will meet it not with obedience or defiance, but with open eyes and open hands. For we are the children of the pause between empires, and our inheritance is not power, it is the simple, stubborn art of beginning again. They will say the world ended once, and perhaps it did, but not with fire, not with war, not even with grief. It ended quietly when people stopped pretending that obedience was love. The family, the councils, the rituals, all of them dissolved not because they were destroyed, but because they were finally seen. And seeing, I have learned, is the most dangerous freedom of all. The estate stands now like a memory that refuses to fade, its stones breathing, shadows patient. Sometimes I walk through its corridors at night and hear whispers in languages no one speaks anymore. The voices of those who kept the feast alive for centuries, unsure of how to live without it. I whisper back, not in defiance but in understanding. For even they were only human, born into the illusion that order could replace wonder. The fields beyond the gates glow faintly with fireflies, and I think of all the generations who dined beneath chandeliers believing light belonged to them. Now, the stars return that light freely, and no one demands gratitude. The world continues, not perfect, not pure, but awake. Children plant trees without knowing their names. Strangers share food without asking for reason. The feast has not vanished, it has changed shape, scattered into 1,000 small kindnesses that ask for nothing in return. And perhaps that is how all stories should end. Not with triumph, not with despair, but with the quiet realization that every ending is a tab. Cleared for what comes next. When the wind moves through the orchard, it sounds like pages turning. I listen, and I understand at last. History was never about power or blood or inheritance. It was always about hunger. The hunger to belong, to be seen, to be free. And in the soft rustle of leaves, I hear the world answering its own question. We were never meant to serve the feast. We were meant to become it.